Jai Hind students, welcome to my YouTube channel. Students, waking up in the morning is one of the toughest things, isn't it? It may not be for all, but surely for many, right? The best thing to get rid of such a habit is to find out things that you can do in the morning hours, which can interest you or which can motivate or inspire you. Moreover, waking up early is also good for your health. So the first step you need to do is to find out your inspirational trigger for your morning and do become a morning person, right? So with that, let's begin this particular session. Here, in continuation with the previous session, in this particular episode, we'll be discussing different types of friction. Then we'll be discussing the method so as to convert sliding friction into rolling friction. Then we are going to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of friction as well, right? So, before we start, let me introduce about solid friction, fluid friction. Students, just remember, it is not only that friction exists between the two solid surfaces in contact. That we have already discussed, isn't it? There is static friction, which is a self-adjusting force. There is limiting static friction, kinetic or dynamic friction, isn't it? We have discussed them all. But friction also exists when a solid body moves through a fluid. It moves through a liquid or it moves through a gas. Then also it encounters resistance or friction. You have heard about air resistance? That is the friction offered by gas, by air, isn't it? Similarly, students, the friction offered by liquid or the fluid, that phenomena is known as viscosity. And that opposing force which tends to retard the motion of the fluid is known as viscous force. So, liquid offers friction, liquid or gases, that is fluid offer friction, and that concept is known as viscosity. And the retarding force which tends to oppose the motion of a fluid, that is known as viscous force. Anyway, we'll be discussing these topics in detail in the later units, right? Presently, in this episode, I will restrict myself only to solid friction. And always remember, students, solid friction, that is the friction between the two solid surfaces, is more than that of the friction between a solid and a liquid or between a solid surface and gaseous and a gas, right? So, solid friction is maximum. Clear? So, in this episode, we will begin with the types of friction. So, there are various types of friction like static friction, limiting static friction, sliding friction, rolling friction, fluid friction. Fluid friction, as I have told you, students, it will be discussed later on in the chapter of viscosity or viscous force. So, before we start discussing about the various things, let us watch this video which I have prepared so as to elaborate about the types of friction. Right? Let's watch this video.
Forms of friction. Friction can be broadly classified into these four categories: static friction, sliding friction, rolling friction, and fluid friction. We'll be discussing the first three types of friction. Suppose that a force F is applied on a body along the horizontal, which is small enough to move it. Now, as the body remains at rest, it implies that an opposing force equal to the applied force must have come into play, resulting in zero net force on the body. This force, which acts in a direction opposite to that of the applied force, is known as the static friction. So it must be remembered, static friction does not exist by itself. When there is no applied force, there is no static friction. It comes into play only when the applied force tends to move the body. Now suppose a force is applied and a body tends to slide over the surface of some other body. In such a case, the force of friction that exists between the two surfaces in contact when the body slides, that is known as sliding friction. it is always less than that of the static friction. It is found that a heavy luggage attached with rollers can easily be moved by even a child. Have you wondered why? It is found that it is much easier to move a heavy load from one place to another by placing it over a cart with wheels than to move it by sliding it over the surface. It is because of the fact that rolling friction between the two surfaces is much smaller than the sliding friction between them. It is for this reason that wheel has been considered as one of the greatest inventions. So, rolling friction, remember students, is always less than that of the sliding friction. In practice, as far as possible, sliding friction is converted into rolling friction by making use of wheels and bearings. A ball bearing is used in the axle of fans and in bicycles. A ball bearing consists of two coaxial cylinders between which hard steel balls are arranged as shown. The axle attached to the vehicle fits tightly into the inner cylinder while the wheel is put in the firm contact with the outer cylinder. When the axle rotates, say in the clockwise direction, the steel balls rotate in the anti-clockwise direction and thus allowing the outer cylinder and the wheels to rotate in anti-clockwise direction.
In this short animation, we have discussed the types of friction and then we have discussed the method of converting sliding friction into rolling friction with the help of wheels or with the help of ball bearings. We have discussed the conversion of sliding friction to rolling friction using the ball bearings in detail in that short video, right? So now it's turn to move on to the next topic, which is friction is a necessary evil. Let's try to understand this particular sentence. Friction as a necessary evil. Necessary means there are several instances where friction is desirable. Like students, without friction, we can't walk on the ground. Without friction, I can't write on the board with the help of this marker. If this board, this whiteboard is considered to be extra smooth, then it won't be feasible for me to write on that extra smooth surface. It is only due to the friction offered by this board that some particles stick over it, and that is why the letters or the text are visible to you all, isn't it? So writing on a board, whether it is a whiteboard or it is a blackboard, writing through chalk or writing through a marker on a whiteboard, it is all because of the presence of friction. So friction is very, very essential. At some instances, without friction we can't do, right? While on the other hand, students, friction at some other cases are undesirable also. Due to friction, there is a huge economical loss, right? So what I have done is I have prepared a short video so as to make you understand about this particular topic. So in this short video, we will be discussing the advantages of friction, because of which the friction is absolutely necessary, and also we will be discussing some disadvantages of friction. And that is the reason why friction is also known as a necessary evil, right? So let's watch this video.
Friction is a necessary evil, that is, it has both advantages as well as disadvantages. Friction helps us to walk. When we press the ground with our foot backwards, we receive a forward reaction due to the friction between the foot and the ground. Had there been no friction, like in this case on a slippery ground, the foot will simply slip away. Friction also helps us to write on the blackboard or on a paper. As we write, the chalk particles stay on the board due to the friction. Brakes make use of friction to stop the vehicles. Special high friction materials are used for the brakes of automobiles. Buildings are constructed because of the interlocking of rough surfaces with each other. Without friction, buildings cannot be constructed. Friction is also needed to fix nail on a wall. Nail can't be fixed on a smooth wall. If there is no friction, we cannot light a matchstick. Matchstick box has a rough surface, and as we rub matchstick against it, the heat is produced due to friction and the matchstick lights up. Now let's discuss some disadvantages of friction as well. The soles of our shoes are torn out due to the friction which the ground or the road surface offers. So this is one of the disadvantages of friction. Another disadvantage is the friction causes unnecessary wear and tear of the machinery. Due to friction between the moving parts of a machine, heat is produced which in a way affects the working as well as the life of the machine. Tires of vehicles get damaged due to excessive friction. Thus, friction has both advantages and disadvantages. This is the reason why it is known as a necessary evil.
Students, after discussing the first three topics, now we are left with the last one. That is, we will be discussing the methods to reduce friction. As we have discussed, students, in that short animation, friction has got advantages, that is, it is desirable as well as it is undesirable. So there are some instances where the friction need to be reduced. So let's discuss about the methods of reducing friction, right? Let's start with the first point. The friction between the two surfaces can be reduced by proper selection of the materials. Students, as you are aware, frictional force, it does depend upon the nature of the two surfaces in contact, right? So depending upon the nature of the friction or nature of the surfaces in contact, the friction offered by the surfaces in contact may be higher or it may be lower. I'll give you an example. Students, the friction between iron and concrete is much higher than the friction between rubber and concrete, and that is the reason why wheels are made up of rubber so as to reduce the friction. So students, proper selection of materials is a very essential point, right? Okay, next one is by polishing. What happens is, when we polish a rough surface, then it tends to fill the gap between the two projections. Actually, a layer of the material is formed over the surface. So interlocking between the surfaces get reduced, and as a result, the surface becomes smooth and the friction get reduced. So by polishing of a surface, the interlocking get reduced, the surfaces get smoother, and hence the friction get reduced, right? Let's discuss the third point. Third point is, students, by lubrication. Now this is very important. By using oil or by using grease, that is by oiling or greasing of the surfaces, what it does is, whenever it is applied between the two surfaces, then it spreads and it comes between those two surfaces so as to form a thin layer as it spreads. So basically what it does is, it converts dry friction into fluid friction. And students, we are aware, fluid friction is always less than that of dry friction. So when a layer of grease or oil is established between the two solid surfaces, then due to the conversion from the dry friction into fluid friction, the friction tends to get reduced. So in order to reduce friction, oiling, greasing of the machinery parts is very important. One more thing, students. By friction, heat is produced, isn't it? So by oiling or by greasing, that is by lubrication, the heat produced due to the friction can also be minimized, right? So let's discuss another method of reducing friction by air cushion. Students, we are aware, the fluid friction, that is the friction offered by liquid or the friction offered by gas, is less than that of the solid friction. So what happens is, when we blow air so as to maintain a thin cushion of air between the two solid surfaces, then the friction get reduced because of the fact that fluid friction is less than that of solid friction, right? So by air cushion also the friction can be reduced. Next is by converting sliding friction into rolling friction. This we are already aware of, students. This is the very reason why wheel is considered to be one of the greatest inventions, right? So we are aware, by using wheels, by using ball bearings, this sliding friction can be converted into rolling friction. And as we are aware, the coefficient of rolling friction is less than that of the coefficient of sliding friction. That is, rolling friction is less than that of sliding friction. So the effort required in rolling a body is less, right? So it is preferable to convert sliding friction into rolling friction, either by using ball bearing or by using wheels, right? And last but not the least, by streamlining. Students, you must have observed the shape of high-speed vehicles like jet aeroplanes or bullet trains. Their shapes are streamlined. In the front, it is quite sharp, isn't it? So that's streamlined. So this typical shape is used so as to reduce the fluid friction, right? So these are some of the methods which we have discussed are applicable so as to reduce the friction. So students, I hope all these topics are very clear to you all, right? So we will conclude this session, and do join me in my next lecture then. Till then, do take very, very good care of yourself, and thank you so much.